Okay, reading part 1, No One Book. Mr. Noisy by Roger Hargreaves. Mr. Noisy was very noisy person indeed. For example, if Mr. Noisy was reading this book, he'd be shouting at the top of his voice, and at the top of Mr. Noisy's voice is a very loud place indeed. You can hear it 100 miles away. For example, when most people sneeze, like you can hear them in the next room, but tissue! When Mr. Noisy sneezes, you can hear him in the next country. Now, this story starts when Mr. Noisy was asleep in his bedroom. In his bedroom, in his house, which is on top of a hill. Here's snoring, as you can well imagine. When Mr. Noisy snores, that is a snore worth hearing. It sounds more like a herd of elephants than a snore. Then Mr. Noisy's alarm clock went off. Mr. Noisy's alarm clock sounds like no other alarm clock in the world. It sounds more like a fire engine. Mr. Noisy woke up. And so, too did all the people who lived in Wobbletown, which is at the bottom of Mr. Noisy's hill. See, that's Mr. Noisy's. See, that's Mr. Noisy, that thing there. It is. I can see that. Later that day, Mr. Noisy decided that he had to go for shopping. He went out of his house, shutting the door behind him. Bang! The door wobbled, the house wobbled, the whole hill wobbled, Wobbletown wobbled, even a bird flying high above water. I meant wobbled. Then Mr. Noisy walked up the hill. Clump, clump, clump. He walked inside the baker's shop. Crash went the door as he opened it. Bang went the door as he shut it. "I'd like a loaf of bread," boomed Mr. Noisy to Mrs. Crumbs, the baker's wife. Mrs. Crumb terribly and sold him a loaf. Then Mr. Noisy walked along in the street to the butcher. Clump, clump, clump. He walked it into the butcher's shop. Crash went the door as he opened it. Bang went the door when he shut it. "I'd like a piece of meat," boomed Mr. Noisy to Mr. Bacon the butcher. Mr. Bacon timbered and sold him some meat. See, he's shouting. Maybe let's see what happens now. I think Mrs. Crumbs is gonna tell Mr. Bacon what happened to their stores maybe. Afterwards, Mr. Crumb met Mr. Bacon in the street. "We really must do something about Mr. Noisy being so noisy," she said. "Absolutely," replied Mr. Bacon. "But what?" "I know," said Mrs. Crumb. and she whispered into Mr. Bacon's ears. Mr. Bacon smiled, and a small smile which grew into a broad grin. Mrs. Crumb, he said, I think you have the answer. That following day, Mr. Noisy went again shopping down in Wobbleton. Clump, clump, clump. He went into Mrs. Crumb's shop. I would like a loaf of bread, he boomed. Sorry, what did he say? Asked Mrs. Crumbs, pretending not to hear. I'd like a loaf of bread, Mr. Noisy shouted. Sorry, said Mr. Crumb. Mrs. Crumb, not Mr. Crumb, putting her hand to her ear. Can you speak up, please? I'd like a loaf of bread, roared Mr. Noisy. I can't hear you, replied Mrs. Crumbs. Mr. Noisy gave up and went out. Mr. Noisy went into Mr. Bacon's shop. I'd like a piece of meat, he boomed. Mr. Bacon pretended not to move. I'd like a piece of meat, Mr. Noisy shouted. Did you say something? Asked Mr. Bacon. I said I like a piece of meat, roared Mr. Noisy. Pardon, said Mr. Bacon. Mr. Noisy gave up and went home and went to bed, hungry. That day after, Mr. Noisy tried again. He went into Mr. Crumb's shop. I'd like a loaf of bread, he boomed. A what? Asked Mrs. Crumbs. Mr. Noisy started shouting at the very top of his voice. I loaf of... And then he stopped and then thought. And then he said quietly, I'd like a loaf of bread, please, said Mrs. Crumb. Mrs. Crumb smiled. Certainly, she said. Then Mr. Noisy went into Mr. Bacon's shop. I'd like a piece of meat, he boomed. Did you say something? Asked Mr. Bacon. Yes, I did, shouted Mr. Noisy at the very top of his voice. I said I'd like a... And then he stopped and then thought. And then he said quietly, I'd like a piece of meat, please, Mr. Bacon. Mr. Bacon smiled. My pleasure, he said. So no carrying his bread and his meat. Mr. Noisy set off home, and then he'll clump, clump, clump. Then he stopped. Then he thought, and then he do. You know what he did? He tiptoed. A tiptoe was something that Mr. Noisy had never tried before. It was fun. Mr. Noisy arrived at his front door. He put out of his hand to open the door. And then he stopped. And then he thought. And then you you know what he did? He opened the door very quietly and stepped inside, and then shut the door very gently. Quietly and gently. There were two things that Mr. Noisy had never tried earlier. That was fun too. And did you know something? From then until now, Mr. Noisy isn't anything like he used to be. You know something else? The people of Wobbleton were delighted, especially Mr. Bacon, Mrs. Crumbs and Mr. Bacon. And do you know something else? Mr. Noisy has learned how to whisper. The end. Mr. Man and Little Miss book. Alright? We're gonna do another one. So, bye!